This is Dateline News and Conversation. There's an awful lot that's been happening in the world today, starting with the incredible news from January 3rd, when the United States went into Venezuela, abducted the president and his wife, took them to New York to stand trial. There's been a lot of speculation about that. We're not going to delve into that too much tonight, but we're going to kind of look at what has happened in the last just 6 days between January 3rd and today, January 9th. There's a lot that's happening. I think the world has changed. And what we're seeing emerging is just pure, raw power. My guest tonight, he should be on all of the daily blogs. He should be on The Judge. He should be on a Danny Haiphong show. He should be all over Redacted day after day after day. You're not going to find him there. Ironically, he's on a lot of international media platforms, from Russia to China to Al Jazeera in Iran. He's one of the most important and influential people talking about not only issues that are happening today, but what's happening in the world and why it's happening. My guest is Peter Kuznick. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Regis. Thanks for that generous introduction.
Well, it's not generous. It's all a matter of truth. People, they should know you by now on my show. You're a professor of history at American University, the founder of the Nuclear Studies Institute. You co-authored the book, which you can see right over your shoulder in the background, The Untold History of the United States. You're coming out with a new volume. You authored that with your friend and mine, Oliver Stone. It's probably the most important book that people really have to read to understand the real history of the United States of America. It's unfortunate that most Americans have no idea what that history was about. If they did, we might be in a different place today, Peter. I'm so happy to have you back. I want to start, Peter, with the news that I woke up to this morning here in Crimea, the Russian Federation, that Russia had unleashed the second Oreshnik missile. It's a hypersonic missile, and it destroyed the largest European, it's in Ukraine, but the largest underground storage facility in all of Europe, near Lvov in western Ukraine. Deep underground, it blew it to pieces. The first thing I thought, and what I started reading was this a message that Russia was sending, not just to the EU, that has been threatening war with Russia. But Peter, I want to ask your opinion. Do you think this was a message that was sent from Russia to Donald Trump?
Yes, especially after the United States seized the oil tanker that was flying under a Russian flag in the presence of Russian submarines and other Russian ships. That was a very, very dangerous and provocative thing for the United States to do. That could have triggered a direct military confrontation between the US and Russia. But this specific use of the Oreshnik, as you say, the second time they've used it, was explicitly in response to the attack on Putin's residence in Novgorod. The Russians issued a statement that this was their Russian response to Novgorod. Now, they could have hit that area with other kinds of missiles. However, they chose the Oreshnik because to shoot it from that distance, to fire it from that distance and be able to penetrate that deep into the ground required an Oreshnik missile. But it was sending a clear message. This was very close to the Polish border. It was very close to the airport, which most of the Western arms are shipped into Russia from. And so they were showing that they are capable of taking out targets anywhere in Europe with this Oreshnik missile. So I think it's very much of a statement to the United States, very much of a statement to the Europeans, especially again coming on the heels of that statement signed by Britain and France that they were going to position troops and other military assets inside Ukraine. Russia has made clear they are never going to accept that. And Russia's response that those troops are now legitimate targets if they set foot inside Ukraine. Uh, this get the rhetoric and the reality seems to keep escalating, getting more intense, more belligerent, and more hostile. As just from the standpoint of the world, the bullet atomic scientist is going to issue the new Doomsday Clock. I don't know the exact date, but it's in the next couple weeks. If they don't move it substantially closer to midnight, I don't know what's wrong with them. Did I mention to you last time that I've spoken to the editor of the Bulletin and I asked him why last January they only moved it from 90 seconds before midnight to 89? His response was, well, they thought about 88, but that's the international symbol for Heil Hitler. And that some people wanted to move it much, much closer, but then there were some on the board of experts who resisted that. I did a show with one of the members of the board who was so out of it, but I could see he's the kind of person who would have wanted to keep it at 90 seconds, even though the world was that much more dangerous. But now with these developments, I would move it to 60 seconds. Uh, because I'm terrified. I mean, it's a very helpless feeling in some ways. All you and I can do is speak about it, decry it, try to get people to wake up. But in the United States, which is the greatest threat to world stability and peace, you've got an administration that's out of control. You've got a Congress, especially the Republicans in Congress, which are totally obsequious to that administration. You've got a Supreme Court that's the worst Supreme Court in U.S. history that believes there's no limits to presidential power. At least they haven't established anything. And so the world is being held in this grip of a maniac right now who thinks he can do anything. And that interview to the New York Times, he said, I base things on my own morality. I'm
Unbelievable.
I'm the only judge of what's right and wrong in the world. I mean, these are Hitlerian kinds of concepts by a narcissistic megalomaniac who's got nobody standing between him and the use of the nuclear weapons, blowing up the world, ending life on our planet effectively.
Well, I've said it. I've said it before. Humanity is being held as nuclear hostages. Uh,
Yeah.
and when you talk about the Doomsday Clock, Peter, I know you're familiar with my film 30 Seconds to Midnight. I made that film in 2016. I thought we were that close to nuclear war in 2016. If I would have published that film to release it today, I wouldn't be so generous as you are, put it at 60 seconds. I already had it at 30. I would put it at the final countdown. 5, 4, 3.
It,
So
you
that's
know,
how. That's how dangerous I feel things are. Peter, we chatted a little bit before we came online. I said I've had this feeling in my stomach, a very bad feeling that things have gotten so bad and so out of control that I do believe that um, we are that close. And I know you and I have had this conversation before. Um, I want to go back to the Oreshnik. And, definitely it was a message to all of Europe, the EU. I do think it was a message to the United States, and I agree with you to that. But the Oreshnik can reach any point in the United States. It's a hypersonic missile. It's traveling at like 10,000 kilometers per hour. Uh, it can reach any point in the United States, as well as the other hypersonic missiles that Russia has. And if, Peter, I don't know if there are any sane people in the Trump administration or what's left of the senior command in the Pentagon who understand that the United States is not invulnerable. The United States, Russia, and China combined could wipe out the United States. Now, I don't want to linger on that because I think we've really said enough. But I want to rewind to January 3rd.
Yeah.
Peter, when you woke up and you first heard the news or saw the news of what Trump was bragging about this incredible, nothing like it before in human history, where the United States Special Forces, Delta Force, just went into Caracas, got into the presidential palace, and abducted President Maduro and his wife and whisked them out of the country back to New York to stand trial. Peter, I really don't want to get into speculation with you about was it a stand down? Was he, uh, did his immediate people and his vice president um, make a deal with the United States to whisk him out of the country without really any shots being fired? No, I don't want to get into that. I want to know what your thoughts were at the time of the significance of this action by Donald Trump in the United States.
Well, um, I was shocked. I was horrified, but I should have expected it. I mean, they had the USS Gerald R. Ford, the biggest aircraft carrier in the world. They had 150 other warships in the area. They had what, 10 or 15,000 troops. What we didn't know is that they'd been planning this for months. We do know that they've been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela going back to, well, Chavez took power in 1999 and then he died in 2013. But Chavez doubled down on the Venezuelan nationalization of its oil. You know, oil, in the minds of the Trump administration, oil is worth more than gold, although Trump is obsessed with gold, as we know. It'd be very funny if instead of the gold, he'll replace the gold in his office with oil now. So instead of all that gold there, you'll see smears of oil on the wall because it's more valuable. Trump this week, Trump has dismantled all of the environmental constraints in the United States. He withdrew the United States from the international climate and other treaties. Uh, Trump is embracing the massive increase of fossil fuels. He says that climate change is a Chinese hoax. And, if he doesn't blow up the world with nuclear weapons, he's doing everything he can to destroy the world with fossil fuels and global warming. I mean, so the man is bent on total destruction. And so when I woke up and I heard this news, but I saw it in the context of what else he said, that this was not a one-off, that this was, immediately started threatening Mexico, Cuba, Colombia, Iran. You know, clearly in his mind, and you look at the people he's got around him. I started using again the 19th century word kakistocracy, which means government by the worst people. But he's got the worst of the worst people there. He's got the outright fascists, and that's Hegseth and Miller. Then he's got the outright anti-communist imperialist, Little Marco. Then he's got the lawbreakers, you know, Pam Bondi and Christy Nome and others. I mean, one is worse than the next. And they have this vision of themselves as being unfettered, unlimited, unchallengeable on the global scene, that they can do whatever they want. The discussion about Greenland, which I guess we'll get into later, I won't go there yet. But this idea, and Trump himself is not an ideologue like the others are. He's just an old-fashioned bully. He's that big fat kid on the playground who would beat people, smaller kids up and take their lunch money. I mean, but is that just an old-fashioned bully, uh, and being egged on by the worst of the worst and the most dangerous, who, you know, have no morality, and enable him, encourage him, egg him on. Um, the world is in a very dangerous moment. It's funny to watch the Europeans. But that again gets to Greenland, so we'll hold that off till for later
Well,
discussion.
let's talk a little bit more about this cast of gangsters, thugs that are surrounding Trump. Um, some of the people I'm talking to here in Russia uh, are fully aware that Trump is not in charge. Certainly, you know, uh, the Russians have said for some time, it doesn't matter who the president is, the policy doesn't change. They know that, for example, Trump now is not calling the shots. And so he's surrounded by this group of, call them what you want, uh, Rubio, Hegseth, uh, Pam Bondi, that guy in the FBI, Cash Patel, whatever the heck his
Well,
name is. These people are lawless, um,
yes,
and and that's not all. I think Peter, he's got to have IPAC behind him. He's got to have Israel behind him. He's got to have the international globalist bankers behind him. He's not running the show. I and I wonder if you feel that he's just a convenient uh, figure and mouthpiece for this final assault of these, I don't know what to call them, globalists, deep state capitalists. Uh, he's just the one that's out in front showing the world what's coming. Do you think that what's happening right now is this final assault in this epic battle for the future control of the planet? Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that we're seeing two different visions. Uh, his national security strategy, which we talked about last time, pretty much laid out what these people are doing. You put that together with the Project 2025 report, which also had this grandiose vision of U.S. domination. And you see that there are two different ways the world is going. I think it's very unfortunate that Russia sent troops into Ukraine in 2022. Not because it wasn't provoked. As we know, it was highly provoked. Not because it wasn't deserved. In some senses, it was, but because it set the precedent, not the first time, but the first time very recently, reinforced the precedent that they could do what the U.S. has been doing over and over and over and over again, and that the use of arms and use of force is legitimate even in the nuclear age. So I think that that lowered the standard, lowered the threshold. Uh, but what Trump is doing now is very, very different because he's doing it at a time when Russia and China are trying to lead the world in a different direction. We had the recent meetings in Beijing where you see Modi and Putin holding hands and meeting with Xi Jinping. To me, one of the major developments in recent years is that China and India are trying to resolve their differences peacefully, diplomatically. To me, that's the direction of the future. That's the SCO. That's the BRICS. That's the global South. That's what the African Union wants to see. That's what Latin America was beginning to line up with. Uh, the major influence in Latin America was not the United States, it was China. China was a leading trading partner with all these countries in Latin America. China was the force behind economic development in Latin America, not the United States, not the IMF, not the World Bank. China had replaced the United States and the West and Europe as the driver of global development, peaceful global development. Uh, that I don't know. I don't think I mentioned last time we were talking that what Jimmy Carter said in 2019. Did I say that last time? Because he
Go
gave
ahead.
it, Jimmy Carter, who was a terrible president, but a great ex-president. Uh, in 2019, he spoke to the congregation in Plains, Georgia, and he said, I got a call last night from Donald Trump, and he was very concerned about China's taking, replacing the United States as the dominant force in the world. He was very concerned about what he called the Chinese century. And Carter said told the congregation, but I told him I wasn't concerned about that. He says, do you know how many countries China has invaded since 1979? None. So while the United States has been involved in one military operation after another, he said, uh, since the founding of this country, do you know how many years the United States has had when it's been at peace? 16. He said, China, while we've been spending trillions of dollars, wasting trillions of dollars on these forever wars, China has been building tens of thousands of miles of high-speed railway. Do you know how many miles of high-speed railway the United States has? Zero.
Zero.
You look at the different models, and the China model represents something much more positive. Now, he, like I, thinks that democracy is important, and I'm critical of the Russian system. I'm critical of the Chinese system because I'd like them to be more trusting of the people to do the right thing. And I welcome dissent. I think dissent is the lifeblood of a country, and that leaders of other countries don't see it that way. But the fact that these countries are pushing for peaceful development, which is why we need to end the war in Ukraine, not for the reasons that the Europeans want or that Trump wants, but for the reasons that the Russian people want. For the reasons they applauded me at the Moscow International Film Festival when I called for an end to the war as quickly as possible. Uh, and the there are two different directions, and one is toward peaceful development, and the other is toward warmongering. And sadly, the Europeans have fallen into the warmongering camp and feel very, very impotent. And their impotence has come out even more strongly around Greenland now. They like to talk tough. They only like to talk tough when they got the U.S. standing behind them. And what we see now with the most recent developments in terms of peace negotiations is that Trump is leaning much more toward Zelensky and Ukraine again, even though Trump vacillates back and forth, up and down, which is what I kept saying to my Russian friends. I was over there many times uh, before and during and after the Trump's first election. And I'd sometimes be the only person at a conference who would say that Russia would be better off with a sane, stable, predictable, horrible warmonger like Hillary Clinton than they're going to be with somebody who's so rash and impulsive and quixotic and so uh, volatile, like Donald Trump. And my Russian friends disagreed, and afterwards they said I was right. Because well, you're not going to. We're not in good shape with either of them. But Hillary Clinton at least is predictable and predictably bad, but predictable. Where Trump is bad but unpredictable.
Uh, Boy, that was a lot to break down. I want to go back to a couple of things you mentioned. Um, in terms of Donald Trump and the 28-point peace plan or 19-point peace plan, uh, Peter, I have to think it's finished. I have to think that Russia, uh, beginning on January 3rd,
Yes.
everything that's happened since the seizure, not only of that oil tanker flying under a Russian flag, but it's also been reported that the United States has seized several other oil tankers in the Caribbean, probably headed towards Cuba or somewhere else. Um, do you think that that Russia has finally realized that this shuttle, I can't call it diplomacy, deal making between Witkoff and Kushner back and forth, and Trump wanting to pose as a mediator and buddies with buddies with Putin. Uh, do you think that it's over? Do you think Russia has finally come to a consensus, just in terms of this possibility of Trump negotiating peace?
Yeah. Well, I never thought that Trump could negotiate peace because negotiations take patience. It takes time, it takes hard work. Trump wants a show. He's all about the show of things. You know, even with Venezuela, they love the show of it, the military show, the spectacle. He's into spectacles. He's not into doing the hard work. So in terms, it's not even regime change. It's the same old regime in there, except that Maduro is gone. Um, the CIA actually recommended that they don't overthrow the entire government. I think they learned from what they did to the Ba'ath in Iraq, where they created this. They went after the Sunnis and created this chaos there. And I think they saw that. They they don't quite they're not smart enough to get a real lesson, but they get pieces of a lesson. One of the interesting things to me was who was absent in this whole thing, and that was Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard is nowhere to be seen. And I asked some of my friends who are top security insiders, and they say that Gabbard is on the outs. And it's interesting to me that she's been on the outs since June 10th. And that's when she released that 2.5, the 3-minute video, we've talked about that starts off in Hiroshima and says that the world is closer to nuclear annihilation now than it's ever been. Trump was angry. He rebuked her in front of a lot of people for releasing that. He said, I don't like it. I don't agree with it. It makes me look bad. Uh, and because she said there's these warmongers in all these capitals who are driving the world toward nuclear annihilation. And so Tulsi, who was a very decent person when she was a Democratic lawmaker, And then she got down in the Trump administration and backed Trump and MAGA and started sacrificing her principles. And in those meetings, those cabinet meetings, she would grovel to Trump just like everybody else would. And so I really was disappointed. But she's not been part of this. She used to issue statements opposing Trump's plans to take over Venezuela during the first administration. So she clearly doesn't support this kind of craziness. Uh, which is a good sign. He doesn't like to fire people. He likes to bring in Elon Musk to fire people for him, but he hasn't fired Tulsi yet. Uh, but then, as we also mentioned, then the head of the Sergei Narishkin, the head of Russia's SVR intelligence agency, in November said that civilization is closer to a breaking point, to totally dissolving than we've ever been before. So you've got the heads of the intelligence agencies knowing what madness this is, but the point you're making about the these other advisors, people around Trump, the enablers, the people who not only enabling him but urging him on, that's a different, one of the big differences between Trump and Putin. Putin also has those people, the Medvedevs and the hardliners. And he's told friends of mine that that there are a lot of people to his right, the extreme nationalists, the hawks, who want him to be much more aggressive inside Ukraine and elsewhere. And he resists them. And he's still resisted them. But he did have some residual hope that Donald Trump would be an honest broker in this. And when they met in Alaska, Putin thought that Trump had understood what he means by the root causes and was going to support that and not support some limited ceasefire that during which Ukraine was just going to rearm, that was going to break down. What we need is a permanent settlement there. That's also in Ukraine's interest. We don't want to look at one of the things that I've said all along is we're better off if this is not a humiliating defeat for Ukraine, that we have to think about, how to maintain stability in Ukraine and the interest in rebuilding Ukraine and having Ukraine be neutral, but having a bright future. And this is not going to happen with Zelensky in power, from anything I can see, or Zelensky. I don't know who's going to take over in Ukraine, but we need some new thinking in Ukraine and a new kind of leadership there also. So yeah, I think the world, the possibility, you say 30 seconds or then even less. I say 60 because I think it's the closest we can get away with. But I act as if it's 30 or 10. That's and I just co-authored a piece about the NPT and the New START Treaty. What is the lesson that the world is going to take from the U.S. invasion of Venezuela? It's the lesson that North Korea took from the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And the North Korea's government newspaper put out a statement saying that the one mistake that Saddam Hussein made was to not have weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
Because if they hadn't given up their weapons of mass destruction, especially if they had built nuclear weapons, then the United States wouldn't have been able to invade. But I think that's the lesson that a lot of countries are going to take, including Iran, from the Iranian perspective, between Israel and the United States. I don't want them to develop nuclear weapons because the whole region will go nuclear after that. But nuclear anarchy is a real possibility. I just look at those recent articles in Foreign Affairs magazine saying that Japan should develop nuclear weapons quickly, and one in Foreign Policy magazine saying that Japan, Germany, and Canada should all develop nuclear weapons quickly. That's not, we're on the verge of nuclear anarchy as it is. And if that happens, South Korea will go next. 73% of South Koreans in the polling say they already want South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. And there's Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. There are so many. Mohammed al-Baradei said years ago, when he was the head of the IAEA, that 40 countries have technological capability of developing nuclear weapons. And that's what Kennedy feared. And that's why Kennedy put so much pressure on the Israeli leaders to not develop nuclear weapons. But they lied to him and they went ahead and did it anyway. And Johnson tolerated it. And uh, so we are in Civilization is Discontents in 1929, a beautiful but tragic book by Sigmund Freud. Before World War One, Freud had a different duality between the life instinct or the eros and the reality principle. But then in 1929, he posits what later gets called thanatos, or the death instinct. And he says the struggle between eros and thanatos, and that human history and society and culture are driven by this death instinct. I'm simplifying it somewhat because it's a more complex argument, and it was actually tied to the second law of thermodynamics and to the entropy principle. But this idea of this destructive impulse, human beings really can wipe themselves off the face of the earth. The kind of thinking in Dr. Strangelove or even Failsafer, the great nuclear movies, and that the people who have warned about the threat that we pose to the planet, you know, it- Robert Lifton, my dear friend Robert J. Lifton, the brilliant psychiatrist who wrote books like Death and Life, some of the earliest studies, he did Nazi studies, he did Chinese brainwashing studies, he did Vietnam studies, but he recently made his name by studying the survivors of the atomic bombing. And he posited this idea about that human beings can only really think about nuclear annihilation for about 20 minutes. And then it becomes too horrific a thought that they've got to re let go of it and focus their mind on something else. He calls it nuclear numbing, psychic numbing. And as a species, we should be saying we should be getting rid of nuclear weapons because nobody should have the power to end life on the planet. Right now, Putin and Trump have it. Putin is not going to end life on the planet. Trump could do it. First of all, his understanding of things is so minimal. I think I mentioned last time we talked, but it might have happened afterwards. They had this meltdown during one of his Christmas addresses in the White House to his friends and family, his closest people. And in the middle of it, he goes off on a 6-minute tangent about snakes in Peru. And he talks about poisonous snakes in Peru for 6 minutes. And he says black mambas and white mambas. And he says to them, says, do you know how many people die of snake bites every year in Peru? 28,000, he says. Well, people were smart enough to look it up. And the reality is 10 people have died by poisonous snake bites over the last 15 years. But with somebody who's that delusional, does Trump understand anything about nuclear weapons? Does he really understand about nuclear winter? Has he done anything to respond to Putin's appeal to uh, to have a 1 year extension of the New START treaty so we can negotiate another nuclear arms control treaty that at least limits the number of nuclear weapons? Trump has not responded to that. Still, and this runs out in February 5th, and we're less than a month away, and Trump still hasn't acted on this. So anybody who's scared shitless, can't sleep, or wakes up in the middle of the night is a sane person. Anybody who sleeps, and can't sleep is delusional. because we are at that danger, such a dangerous moment in history. And so one of the countries Trump is threatening is Iran. And we know that Netanyahu met with Trump again recently. Netanyahu came and they met in Mar-a-Lago. And we know that Netanyahu is pushing for a next stage of the invasion of Iran, uh, Israel, and the United States. We know that Trump brags about how perfect the first attack on Iran was, how we totally destroyed their entire nuclear program, which is not true, of course, and which his own intelligence people immediately said was not true. But Trump still sticks by that. And so Netanyahu and probably Trump have explicitly threatened Iran. And, you know, that could be one of the triggers. We have so many potential triggers for World War III that we don't pay attention to. So people, a lot of the Western experts in quotes say this gives a green light to China to invade Taiwan. Well, if China wanted to invade Taiwan, they had a green light before this. They don't need Trump's invasion of Venezuela in order to do that. But what China hopefully realizes is this is China's opportunity to replace the mythic United States as the moral leader. American exceptionalism was based on the idea that the United States was not only different than all other countries, but the United States was better. That the United States, if it gets involved militarily of necessity, is to spread freedom and democracy. One of the things that was so telling about Trump's statement, he didn't mention, not only not mention drugs, which was the bullshit excuse he was giving for blowing up the boats. Uh, he didn't give a shit about that. He didn't mention democracy, human rights, Maduro's dictatorship. He didn't mention any of that because the United States never really cared about that. So we've supported all these right-wing dictatorships, military dictatorships, death squads throughout Latin America. And uh, so this is China's opportunity. The United States has completely negated any fantasy that the U.S. represents some higher moral force in the world, that we want to spread freedom and democracy. All Trump talked about was oil and power and threatening other countries. This is so Xi Jinping can now replace the United States as the moral force. He can quote Jimmy Carter that we haven't invaded anybody since 1979 in that brief skirmish with Vietnam, and that we have to take a very different direction globally. And he can assert that with new credibility since the United States has acknowledged that it doesn't care at all about well-being, about peace, about development. It doesn't, instead of development, the United States wants to steal Venezuela's oil. We're going to steal 30 to 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil. And we're going to run the country with gunboats off the coast and fighter planes and threats that if they don't do what we want and give us everything we want, their resources, their oil, their minerals, their gold, then we're going to invade again. What a world. It's the law of the jungle writ large without any pretense, without any facade. Previously, everybody's had a facade for why they do what they do. But the United States has now totally ripped off the facade. It's like the Wizard of Oz.
Peter, whew, there was so much there. I almost don't know where to begin, but I do. Well, I want to go back to something you said uh, about the threat of nuclear war, that humanity now has the ability, the capability, the technology to destroy all life on the planet. At the end of my film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, Dr. Helen Caldicott,
Yeah.
who was one of the most well-known, prominent anti-nuclear advocate ever, she said at the end of my film, "Are we an evolutionary aberration,
Mm.
designed in an evolutionary sense not to survive. Peter, when I look at where we are today, uh, maybe we're not intended to survive. I don't know. I don't want to end on that note. I want to get to some other
Yeah,
things to talk
I
about.
don't want to believe that. I mean, intellectually, I know you're right, but in my heart, I can't believe that. In my heart, I have to have hope. We're still here, and hopefully, sanity will prevail. Maybe it's
Yeah,
why I do so many interviews in Russia and China. So my way of trying to speak to Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin to take the world in a different direction. I mean, what I say in so many of my interviews is what we lack are global statesmen, that there's nobody who speaks for the planet anymore. Maybe Guterres does. Sometimes the Pope does. The last Pope, and now this current Pope also. And I'm I'm trying to get people to think in terms of the planet. The differences between us, the religious differences, the racial differences, the ethnic differences are pale by comparison. They're nothing. The things that unite us are so much stronger, more powerful, but we don't think that way as myopic human beings. But if somebody came down from another planet and they saw that the richest six people have more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion people, and they see all our divisions and our battles and our skirmishes, that's why I said I was so glad to see uh, Putin and Modi holding hands and talking with Xi Jinping. You know, that any progress we make toward seeing our common humanity and acting on that basis rather than these parochial. But you look at the people around Trump, they are the worst of the worst in that regard.
yeah.
I mean, Marco Rubio only cares about Latin America. They used to say that people in the State Department would say that Wolfowitz knew nothing was going on in the world outside of Iraq. That was his fixation. Well, Rubio's fixation is Cuba, and he wants to get back at Cuba. His parents left Cuba. And Rubio says lyingly, because they all lie every minute they speak, but Rubio says that his parents fled the Castro regime after Castro came to power, when we know in reality his parents left 3 years before Castro came to power in 1956, when Batista was in power and the U.S. controlled Cuba. But that's why he wants, well, that's why the reason he wants the oil is to cut it off from going to Cuba in hopes that the Cuban government will collapse and he can ride back in and be the viceroy or the dictator of Cuba. Uh, I mean, these are not good people in any sense. And a lot of the experts kept saying that, at least during the first Trump administration, there were some adults in the room. When Trump said that he wanted to increase U.S. nuclear arsenal tenfold, Tillerson called him a fucking moron. At least they were. And Rex Tillerson is not my idea of a good person,
Yeah.
but got General Kelly and other people around him. McMaster is also not my idea of a good person, but these people compared to the crew around him now, where they've purged, Hexat has purged all the military leaders who had some reasonableness about them, and now he's surrounded by again these empty vessels.
Peter, I wanted to get to what I think is the major question that a lot of people have. Given what we've been talking about, given what Trump has been doing, and we'll get into the Greenland thing, we'll get into Iran in the next few days because those are the things I think that are previews of coming attraction. But where we are today, Peter, the big question for me and for a number of other people is what can Russia and China effectively do? Now, you've stated very eloquently, they are the statesmen. They are the ones that have been concerned about the future of humanity, the future of the planet. They're the leaders of the BRICS movement. It's a movement that's diametrically opposed to United States unilateral hegemonic control of the planet. Peter, in your mind, what can they realistically do right now, given what the United States just has become and what they're doing?
I think the first step, but if I had their ear, I would say what's going on is so important, so dangerous at this moment that they've got to establish themselves as moral leaders, which means that they have to end the war in Ukraine. Uh, it's in Russia's interest, it's in Ukraine's interest. But once Putin does that, he'll be in a much stronger position to inveigh against what the U.S. is doing. And he could even cite the U.S. invasion of Venezuela as the reason. I mean, if I could write a speech for him, I would say that even though we were provoked into invading Ukraine, and even though we were justified in doing it, I wish I had thought differently at the time and had decided not to do it. Uh, and I think he'd regained the moral stature globally that has been compromised by an invasion of Ukraine. And then I think he and Modi and Xi Jinping, along with Lula, Ramaphosa, and some others, uh, could legit, really credibly pose themselves as an alternative to the warmongers in Europe, to the warmongers in Washington, and say that the world needs to go a different direction. And that direction is not about war. As Modi liked to say, this is not a time for war. This is not an era for war. Uh, but clearly, that's the direction the world is going. So I think it's so dangerous that I would like to see Russia give up on some of its more maximalist demands and figure out a way to end this that saves some face for Ukraine, in which Russia can get the security guarantees that it needs and can now move us in a different direction. So I think it can be done. I think it would be hard to do, but it would require Putin putting forth a very different vision of the world, which I think is compatible with a lot of what he believes and what a lot of what Xi Jinping believes. And then I think we can really, then the BRICS can become the leading force in the world and a counterposition to the United States warmongering. You know, in about another 10 months, the United States is going to have an election. Maybe. We don't know if Trump's going to allow that. Trump likes to say that there's all these emergencies, national security emergencies that allow him to do everything. And he might say allow him to stop, to halt the election. Um, but if there's an election, Trump is going to get his butt kicked. The Democrats are going to win the House, even though the Republicans are trying to gerrymander to redistrict in a lot of states so they get a lot of free Congress seats. Some of the Democrats are beginning to push back. They see what happened with Zohran Mamdani's victory in New York. They see what's happening with the younger leadership in the party. They see what's happening with uh, young people. Well, not just young people. They see how unpopular Trump's policies are. Only about a third of Americans, even after the invasion of Venezuela is successful, only a third of Americans approve of this. So Trump knows he's in bad trouble. And he says once the Democrats get control of the House, first thing they're going to do is impeach him again. He's warned about that to his Republican allies. So he's got every once in a while he's got a limited, sanity about him when his own instincts are his own interests are at stake sometimes. Uh, so if we can keep the world from destroying itself over the next 10 months, we have a little bit more of a chance of restraining what the US is doing. So I guess the immediate question is, Russia and China have appropriately condemned what the US did in Venezuela. as has Lula, Petro, Rodriguez, uh, some of the Europeans even, but the Europeans are scared to do it because they desperately want Trump to back them on Ukraine because they're afraid to go in there despite all their bluster without U.S. military backing and U.S. intelligence. And so uh, I'm not sure what they can do. They have to speak out more clearly. They have to do everything they can to establish their moral bona fides uh, and speak with a moral vision that's the opposite of Trump and denounce what the United States is doing every time they open their mouths and to do it more aggressively than they ever have and to build up allies and alliances. Uh, it's unfortunate that I think Lula was responsible for not for vetoing Venezuela's entry into BRICS. He's got to put they have a partner status, but they instead opted for Argentina, which wasn't didn't make much sense to me. And we know, for example, that Rodriguez back in 2017, she told Chevron, the big oil company, to donate $500,000 to Trump's inauguration because she wanted to develop friendly, pragmatic relations with the Trump administration. There's a whole history there with Rodriguez and her brother, the head of the National Assembly, who are pragmatic in terms of wanting to work with the United States, which is why Trump has said he wanted to keep her in power, unlike Cabello and some of the others who are much more hardline revolutionaries. So, uh, I'm feeling pretty desperate, but I still think that there's some hope that some of the leaders in the world will realize that this is not a moment for parochial nationalism. This is a moment for true multilateralism, multipolarity, and a very, very different approach to peace and development.